Once again, really welcome to Sweden Game Conference 2016, and especially a very warm welcome to you, David. So David Gaider, Creative Director at Beamdog Studios, with a huge track record, and you will introduce yourself more on that as we move along. As you already picked up, the theme for this year's conference is inclusive game development. And David would start us off with a talk on a practical guide to inclusivity.
Right.
So the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. As you mentioned, my name is David Gaider. I'm currently creative director at a Canadian developer called Beamdog Studios. I'm working on an unannounced RPG. And I'm here to talk to you about inclusivity, not the how part, as that's pretty straightforward at its most basic level. If you have characters in your game, you have them reflect the same variety in the audience that will be playing your game, or who you want to play your game. Rather, I'll be talking about the more practical issues a developer can face in trying to bring more inclusivity into their project. Ideally, there'll be a bit of time left over at the end for questions. We'll need somebody to go around with a mic in that case. But first, I should start with a little bit of who I am, that I'm even here talking to you about this. My first job in the industry was with a company called BioWare, where I was hired as a writer in 1999 to work on an RPG called Baldur's Gate 2. It doesn't really seem like that long ago, just, 17 years? I know lots of people who've been in the industry way longer than that, yet it feels like a lifetime ago. The industry was so different back then. The notion of inclusivity as an issue, even worth addressing in games, simply did not exist. Indeed, I can remember the first time the topic was discussed at work in my presence. Though we didn't call it inclusivity at the time, we were in the middle of developing Baldur's Gate 2, and at the time we had a grand total of 16 companion characters, you can see on the screen. There was an enormous amount of writing to be done. 6 of those 16 were female characters, which it wasn't half, but at the time it seemed like a good number. But let me remove all the companions who weren't explicitly white. That leaves 5. And includes Viconia at the top right there, who's a drow elf and blue, so really it only leaves 4. So that's 4 out of 16 who aren't white, 25%, which isn't too bad, right? Except, of those 4, only 1, Yoshimo on the far right, was originally non-white. I remember the day in development when the writers were told that some of our characters were being changed to another ethnicity. I was writing Valigar on the far left, and he was being made black. And I just didn't get it at the time. Why, I wondered. This seems like such an arbitrary decision. Valigar's voiceover even sounded like John Wayne. It just seemed like such an odd thing to do. I don't remember who told me why, but the answer was, because we have 16 companions and only one of them isn't white, and that's weird. I thought they were wrong about that. They must have missed someone, right? But they didn't. How different it looked when you had all the characters grouped together and you could see them. And I remember thinking, how did we make such a large group of characters and end up with them all being white? And it's because it wasn't part of a discussion. We went with the default because that's what you do when you don't think about it. And the intervention had to be deliberate, because if your team doesn't discuss it, that's the only way it changes. And note that we changed it because we thought it was weird, not because it wasn't inclusive or because that they thought that representation was important. The language just didn't exist for us 17 years ago, and all he could say was, do it, and we did it, and it was fine. I moved on to the writing team for Neverwinter Nights next, and then a Star Wars RPG called Knights of the Old Republic. And I think Knights of the Old Republic is the next time I was aware of the subject coming up. Again, there was no mention of inclusivity or representation. The team was going to include a lesbian party member, not because of any sense of social justice, but because we wanted to, because it added variety. And I say we, even though I had nothing to do with it. I, a gay man, had no idea a gay character could be put into a video game without there being a huge risk of public backlash. But BioWare did it. Even though we felt we had to hide it. Juhani, that's the name of the character, her true nature was kept to subtext. She had strong feelings for a female friend from her past, but not love, and certainly not sex. But she was definitely a lesbian, and it was also fine. The first time I remember it not being fine was after I began work on the Dragon Age series. This was my first stint as lead writer, which just meant having a lot more input into the overall story, and that I was in charge of coordinating the writing team, so it all felt like it was written by one person instead of 7 or 8. And Dragon Age Origins came out not long after the very first Mass Effect, and like that game, had same-sex romances available for both male and female players. This was 2009, just 7 years ago, and it involved the first indication I can recall that not everyone was okay with what we were doing. That intensified 2 years later in 2011 when Dragon Age 2 came out. All 4 of the romances in that game were bisexual, available to any player who pursued them, and 2 of them, one male and one female, made a pass at the player without being prompted to, and that was particularly with one of the characters named Anders, who made a pass at straight male players beyond the pale. Suddenly, whatever flaws the game itself had paled in comparison to the idea that we were, shoving the gay down these players' throats, or not paying enough attention to our real audience, quote unquote, or outright disrespecting them. That's where the conversation was heading in general. And that line of commentary continued right up until the release of my last game with BioWare, Dragon Age Inquisition, in 2014. We had 8 romances total in that game, including bisexual and now also gay romances. Just like Mass Effect 3, DAI had some romances available only to player characters of the same sex. And note that I say player characters of the same sex and not gay players, because from all telemetry, it's unlikely that the only players who engaged in this type of content were gay. The numbers would indicate that either more than gay players actually used the content, or there's a lot more gay players than we thought existed. So one of those has to be true. Either way, this was also the first project where I'd say the language around inclusivity, the ability to engage in a conversation about it on the team, really became ingrained in BioWare's culture. We talked more about the ethnicity of our characters as well as the sexuality, how those and our female characters were portrayed in the game. I wouldn't say it preoccupied us, but we were aware of it, and you could expect it to come up whether you were talking with the design department, with the art department, or with VO. The criticism also reached a new high. Everyone, I think you're all aware there's an online culture war, clearly. I think that it was starting to kick into high gear, and BioWare was being criticized almost constantly, not only by those who saw us as doing too much, but also by those who saw us as not doing enough or not doing it the right way. Depending on who you spoke with, we were either focusing on this aspect of our games too much or not enough. Even so, despite the ongoing criticism, some of it reaching the level of harassment, I'd say, the team was happy both with the game and its reception. And that would turn out to be my last game with BioWare. This year I moved on to a much smaller company called Beamdog Studios, also in Edmonton. And while I can't talk about my new project yet, I will say that so far this year it's sort of opened my eyes regarding how very different it is to work outside of a AAA environment. The risks seem so much greater, and you have to be so much more flexible, but it comes with many unique rewards. So now you have an idea of my background on the subject. BioWare is, I think, a company that's pretty well known for its inclusivity efforts. Note that I say efforts. I'm not suggesting BioWare is perfect at it or that they have no room to improve, but I think it's safe to say that they are on a small list of AAA developers for whom these efforts have been both consistent and ongoing. And during my time there, it was not always the easiest of roads. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, let's run down some of the problems that you can likely expect as a game developer as soon as you start doing anything on this front. First, as soon as you do anything noticeably inclusive, you've opened Pandora's box, and you can expect to find yourself subject to almost any level of criticism or harassment. Some of it all too expected if you're someone who pays attention to online communities or a female developer with any kind of online presence, and some of it which will completely surprise you. Note that I say noticeably inclusive. It's not clear what that is. It's not as if the moment you include a minority character, you're suddenly going to come under fire, but you might. All it takes is for someone out there to decide that what you've done is for the wrong reasons. And suddenly you're on the radar of both those that fight against social justice and those who are proponents of it. As a developer, you will feel caught in the middle of this battle, one you may not have intended to get involved in. Now that sounds bad. Is it really that bad? It can be. And it's worse for a small developer who's not going to be able to weather things like review bombing, as well as a big company. It's actually way safer for a game developer to do nothing at all. You might get singled out for criticism, particularly if you do something egregious, like, I don't know, imply that women are hard to animate. That's a theoretical example. But for the most part, nobody expects a developer to be inclusive. Any criticism you receive is leveled more at the industry as a whole instead of at the developer specifically, so they can avoid being targeted by either side. It's the path of least resistance, and it's unfortunate, but it does exist. Also, if your team is making efforts to actively invite new players to become part of your audience, the act of the invitation itself is going to be considered offensive by some. As an example of what I mean, when I worked on Dragon Age Inquisition, I wrote a major follower character named Dorian, who was gay. We did a press release for each of the characters mentioning what they were about and going over all the major points for them. And for Dorian, included mentioning that he was the first gay character that I had written. Well, that may as well have been all we said, because that's all many people noticed, even though the point of it was to tell gay players out there that we had content of interest to them, and who, let's be clear, these would be the majority of those pursuing this optional content. There were a lot of people who said this was unacceptable. They said Dorian was clearly put in the game just to be gay. What's another? BioWare was pandering to gay players to get their money. We weren't focusing on making a good game. We were spending all our time making political statements. The only way to have a gay character was apparently not to mention it publicly, and preferably not to have the character mention it in the game. It should just be these are generally the comments that we were told. It should just be and never become something that forced me as a player to pay attention to something that I did not want to acknowledge. The idea that there might be gay players who wouldn't know we were trying to include them unless we told them was irrelevant to these people. You will also be asked to justify every choice you make. Now, to a degree, this is already something that's happening in all fan communities across entertainment, not just in video games. They're questioning creator choices more and more, and not just ones involving inclusivity. Some people call this entitlement, but perhaps it's more about the accessibility offered by social media. Whatever the cause, these demands that a creator justify their choices only increase as soon as it's about inclusivity. Why is that character female? That's not realistic. There were no black people in that era. Why do you have to make every character gay? That's all anybody talks about. Why was that black character not written by a black writer? Why are your female characters so sexualized? Some of these questions are respectful. Others aren't. Even if they aren't, you must always respond nicely. Even if you respond nicely, your answer may still cause anger if it's not exactly what the questioner wants to hear. This anger isn't necessarily directed at you because the problems are industry-wide, but it will sometimes feel that way. The moment you do try to address the issue of inclusivity, it will feel like you're stepping into a field of landmines. Just including more minority characters isn't enough. Often it is about how you include them. Do they fall into negative tropes or stereotypes? Do they have any negative qualities which might be perceived as misrepresentative of that group? Was someone from that group consulted, or were they written by someone from that group? It can often feel like minority characters have so many more requirements placed upon them by the audience, and even when you think you've done your due diligence, there will still be somebody, maybe many somebodies, who will accuse you of misstepping. This is guaranteed. There is no point where you will be told, this is good job, and not have anybody tell you otherwise. You might receive some positive media attention for your efforts, but if you did it because you wanted praise from your audience, you should know that at best the reactions will be mixed, and that's simply how it is. And it will feel like you can never do enough. If you include a gay character, that's great. What about a trans character? What about asexuals or demisexuals? If you have a black character, that's great, but what about Asians? I don't see any East Indians or Native Americans in your game. Why don't they exist in your game? They absolutely deserve to exist somewhere in entertainment. The problem is that you, specifically you, with your one game, can't possibly represent the entire breadth of humanity. You can't be everything to everyone. And while that's a completely fair answer for a developer to give, somehow that means that these groups of people rarely seem to exist in any game. So it's completely fair of them to ask, and yet you, the developer, will often be left feeling like the focus for many of these people is on whatever your game lacks rather than what it actually has, and that can be discouraging. So it may seem like that was a long list of terrible things. You'd be like, David, you obviously don't think much of inclusivity. It's not true. It might seem as if I'm being overly negative about the idea, and if so, I apologize. It's not my intention to discourage anyone, but merely to indicate that if you're going to approach this topic, you should do it with a realistic attitude. Making your games more inclusive, particularly if your game has visibility and characters of any depth, is not simple. It's complicated and fraught with frustrations. For a lot of developers, that's more than enough to make them avoid the discussion altogether. And often I'm not sure I can blame them. Most of us did not get into this industry to spend our time arguing with fans online. And at the end of the day, getting your game to ship is enough of a challenge. Everything else can seem like a distraction. But it's not all bad news. There are upsides to inclusivity. So let me go through a few reasons why you should do it before I go any further. For one, you do it because you need the audience. If you're a AAA developer, you've been butting your head against the edges of that traditional demographic for years. The cost of making AAA games keeps going up and up and up and up, but the demographic is not getting any bigger, and everyone is competing for a piece of that particular pie. Maybe you feel you just need to compete harder, but not every developer has come to that same conclusion. There are other people out there in the audience who are underserved. Is there a way to attract them to your game without abandoning your current audience? That's the million-dollar question. Well, these days it's the $100 million question. If you're not a AAA developer, you're also considering what the audience for your particular game is going to be. An underserved demographic can serve you just as well as anyone else. And the only thing stopping you is that there are people out there who are determined that making games not for them is unacceptable, that this constitutes an invasion of their space. Yet their money, the money of this underserved demographic, is just as good as anyone else's. That may seem mercenary, but that's how companies work. They go where their money is, and as the composition and values of the larger gaming audience change, so must the companies. And if the audience for your game isn't your concern as a developer, if you're not the person on the team who worries about selling the game, then consider how this issue affects your creativity, the actual variety you're permitted to include in your game. I once got into a debate online with some folks who were taking issue with one of the plots I'd written. The reason is irrelevant, but what happened was that much of the nice gentlemen from Gamergate got wind of this argument and came rushing to my defense. And they said, we feel developers shouldn't be shackled by political correctness. And it felt weird. I mean, on one hand, being defended by Gamergate sort of told me I was probably on the wrong side of this particular argument. But the fact that they felt that this was something I needed defending from was odd. I guess if one were to assume that left to my own devices, I'd make nothing but games with half-naked characters with giant boobs, and it's only political correctness that's stopping me. If that was your assumption, I guess that would make sense. But when I think about the limitations I've worked under since I started my career, they've never been about political correctness. Think of your average AAA action game. It has a protagonist, the kind of hero you put on the box, right? Can you describe this character? You absolutely can. Male, white, brown hair, probably shaved really close to his head. Maybe they got wild and changed his hair color. Do you think that the developers of that game picked that protagonist because they thought it was the more creative choice? No, of course not. So the idea of anybody rushing to protect me from political correctness seems laughable. If anything, inclusivity has opened up potential we have never really had before. And let's face it, we do this because it needs to be done. You don't need to be social justice warrior on your team, getting in everyone's faces until they do what you see as the right thing. If that's something developers actually do, I've never seen it. You just need to be a developer who wants your games, wants the industry to reflect the breadth of humanity in your audience. And you want people to get over themselves, to just leave you to create what you want to create, because there will be choices enough in the industry to satisfy everyone, ideally. The only way that's going to happen is if people get used to seeing representation in games. If they see it enough times, then the mere existence of something which isn't the default won't stick out quite so much. I can have a gay character in a game, and there won't be articles written about why that's awesome and different, because it won't be awesome and different. It will just be normal. I can have a female protagonist for a game, and nobody will make an article about how revolutionary that is, or wonder, will guys be willing to play as a female protagonist, because we'll just know they will, and it'll be normal. We can stop having talks at cons about representation or about women in the industry, because it will just be normal and we can all move on. I'd really like that. Wouldn't you? So those are good reasons to address inclusivity on your project, but how does one actually start? First off, I'm going to assume you're not in a position to simply dictate to your team that this is a priority. Most of us have somebody we report to, perhaps somebody for whom this might be an unfamiliar subject or even an unwelcome one. This is true even in the environment of a company where inclusivity is actively encouraged, like BioWare. Not everyone you work with will feel the same about it. Just broaching the subject, never mind concerning yourself with how to do inclusivity well, is going to be a daunting task, and doubly so on a team which hasn't already learned to have this conversation regularly. So how would I advise somebody to begin? First off, you need to pick your battles. It's one thing to bring up an issue from time to time, but it's quite another to become that guy. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but when you're that guy, everyone knows you have an issue. And when you put up your hand to speak in the meeting, they're already rolling their eyes because they know what it's going to be about. If you're a woman on the team, perhaps the only woman, you risk becoming that guy if you point out something that affects women in the audience. If you're gay and you want to ask if every character in the lineup of characters really needs to be a bro with that hot girlfriend, you risk being that guy. But it doesn't even need to be something that affects you personally. You don't need to be a woman to have a problem with sexualization, or black to have a problem with black stereotypes. But if you are, you worry about this more than anyone else on the team. And in either case, you feel like you can only rock the boat so much. Honestly, in my experience, a lot of this is actually self-censorship. People on the team probably aren't thinking about this as much as you think they are, and you never know. Others might be waiting for someone to say it, and your team might even honestly appreciate the warning. Not everyone thinks about this stuff, and that's not a crime. But let's say you do speak up, and not everyone's on board with what you have to say. Their objections aren't very different from the ones you hear online, although usually they're going to be worded a bit more nicely. Instead of, shouldn't you be focusing on making the game good, which is an actual comment I've heard many times, they'll say, is this conversation really necessary? Or what does that have to do with anything, with what we're talking about? Or that's a great point, but let's talk about it later. The last one happens a lot. Things getting pushed until a vague time in the future when everyone knows that time's never going to come. We'll see how it tests and then change it if need be. All of us know that once something goes into a game, it eventually gets set in stone unless there's an actual bug, and that's a good reason. To deal with potential issues sooner rather than later. It's hard, however, to overcome objections which, on the surface, sound so reasonable. If you press the issue, you risk being perceived as the one who's being pushy or trying to force the issue. Speaking of force, that's another objection you'll hear, a concern that adding minority characters will come off as too obvious. That someone out there in the audience will look at that black character or that woman and wonder, why are they even present? Or roll their eyes at how the developers have surely turned into social justice warriors. The objection will be worded differently, sure, but it's the same thing. Sometimes you even get team members who hide behind the audience. Oh, I don't feel this way, but people in the audience do, and that's the kind of negativity we can't afford. So what can you do when you encounter these objections? Honestly, it depends on the environment you work in. If you're a manager, you can go out of your way to legitimize people when they speak up. Everyone will be looking to you for cues, and when you dismiss someone, that's noted. If you're not a manager, you can put the ball back in the other person's court without turning it into a confrontation. Don't you think this is something we should be able to talk about responsibly? Is there a way we can approach this topic without it feeling forced? See what ideas they have and give them a chance to explain, or at least clarify how they really feel. But don't allow them to use the existence of a potential problem to become an excuse to do nothing. That happens a lot. And all of this is if you can. The thing about picking your battles is that sometimes you don't engage because that's what you need to do. I don't want to say it as an excuse, but the truth is that you do have a lot of other priorities on your plate, and so does your company. Your company might even be completely sympathetic to what you're bringing up, yet still opt to go with the safe, conservative choice, because not taking the path of least resistance is too much of a risk. And if so, you'll probably have to accept that. In the end, you'll have to decide for yourself how important the subject is to you. I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't value when developing your games, but part of picking battles is also realizing that sometimes you can look for ways to make a change inside your company without dying on every hill. Such as, consider another way to approach the topic is how you personally deal with it. BioWare always allows the player character of their games to be either male or female, but a long time ago I noticed that I always used he when referring to anyone of non-specific gender in my documentation, just as a habit. It's a common habit. So I switched to using she instead. Someone later noticed that and asked me why I did it, and I said to remind myself that the character can be female. I already know that they're going to be male. In fact, that's my default probably when I'm writing in my head. So I need this constant reminder in the documentation, keep this in mind, so it keeps coming up. It was a convention my entire team would later adopt. I also remember a point when the character concepts at BioWare began to change. Normally when the writers create a character, the concept artists provide a number of options, say 8 to 10 variants, each testing out slightly different directions. Thing is, most of these directions would all be white characters until they stopped being. And suddenly we would always get at least a few versions that were of a different ethnicity or even a different gender than we had actually asked for to begin with. The concept artists had decided that this should simply be a thing, so that we, the rest of the team, would consider different options we might not have before. And it worked. If we see the pictures up on the screen, the character on the left was a character in Dragon Age Inquisition called Vivienne from Dragon Age, from DAI. And blonde, white, ice queen that we felt didn't quite work, but we couldn't put our finger on why. And then the concept artist gave us the version on the right that actually ended up in the game. And when we got that concept, it suddenly clicked. I'm not sure exactly what changed, but it made us think about the character differently. It made us think about her possibilities differently. And that's a power you might have on your team, offering options. Maybe someone won't be interested in those options, sure, but maybe it will spark something they did not expect. Maybe it will change the way they look at it. In this case, I remember thinking how very clever it was for the concept artist to expand the possibilities in our project without ever making it a point of contention. Another thing to consider, you need to set a specific time to discuss these issues. And by that, I mean a time to think about why a character couldn't be something else. Female, black, Asian, gay, why not? Or to think about the tropes you'd maybe wandered into without realizing, the stereotypes you'd fallen into as a habit. We all know that game development is a frenzy at the best of times. There's never enough time to do everything. So half of what you do is compromising and the other half is cutting, which means that if you don't deliberately stop and think about this at some point, either early on when you're still in the concepting, or sometime in production when it's still early enough that you can change things, it won't happen. It just won't, and you know it. Not unless it's become second nature to your team to have the conversation. But how many teams is that true for? Let's be honest. We all go with what we know, with what's easiest. And it doesn't take that much effort to be a bit better than that. Put it right there on the schedule. Let's talk about this and make sure you've covered our bases. or covered your asses, if you want to look at it that way. You won't be able to think of everything, but the worst answer if you get complaints later on is that you never stop to think about it at all. More and more, that's becoming an inexcusable defense. One way BioWare approached this was with what we called peer reviews. It's when we sit down after the first pass of a story has been written and talk about it as a group. We're looking for feedback on the story and how well it plays and feels, but we're also asking everyone to think about tropes. That's specified and encouraged. I've told a story previously in public about one peer review meeting when we discussed a plot involving Leliana, a character in the picture from Dragon Age, where a demon assumed her form and tries to seduce the player. And the player could allow that seduction to happen. And we went around the table at the peer review, and us guys went first, giving our feedback, and we had various issues with the plot, but we didn't have a problem with this seduction. And then the women on our team spoke up, and they said they felt it was strange. It felt like you were having sex with someone who looked like Leliana, who's a real person and part of your organization, a subordinate, and it was like you were violating her by proxy. And that in itself is not an issue so much as that it was never addressed in the story, never brought up, and it felt really disconcerting to the women, maybe even a little creepy, and that was a really good point, and not what the writer who wrote that plot actually intended. So we cut the scene. And I thought afterwards that, yes, it was great we had a team where we had women present who could offer their perspective, because it was clear the guys just didn't think about the situation the same way. But it was also great we had a team culture where this kind of input was considered valuable. Because if either of those things hadn't been the case, we would have put the game out with that scene. And the reaction from our female audience could have been terrible. And what would we have said if people came to us publicly and were like, why did you do this thing? Probably would have said, oh, wow, we had no idea. We had never considered that. You were probably overthinking it. That's generally the kind of defense, right? And whose fault would that really have been in that case? And let's face it, not every developer is going to be in a position where they have multiple women involved in the process. Even at BioWare, that was only true on the writing team and maybe a few other select places. You could be dealing with subject matter that nobody on your team can evaluate with authority. So what do you do in that case? You find someone to consult. When one of my writers wrote a transgender character for Dragon Age Inquisition, he reached out to a transgender fan that he trusted and got them to review what he'd written and advise him on ways that he'd misstepped. And he'd misstepped a lot. He made a lot of changes based on the feedback. Did it solve everything? No. One or two people are not going to be able to give you the breadth of experience for an entire demographic. So there will still be people who will say you didn't do it right. But that's going to be true no matter what you create. If you can find at least one consultant who can give you the thumbs up, that's way better than going in blind. If your company can pay for consultation, then even better. There are some excellent consultants out there who are worth the money, who can evaluate not only individual characters, but your entire game to ease your mind. And yes, that might mean that adding content which is outside of your personal experience could be a bit more effort. But tell me how long you as a developer spent perfecting and tweaking that cutscene or that animation or that enemy model. We're devs, and we're no strangers to working hard to get something right. So in closing, I do want to reiterate that I don't have all the answers on this subject. It's a complicated one, as I've said, but one that I feel is increasingly important that the games industry comes to grips with. So I thank SGC for inviting me to speak on it. I think we have time for a few questions. Do we have a microphone? Are there any questions? Okay, I can barely see anybody. There's one over on the left there. A sneaky double question, all right.
Thank you very much. So you talked about challenging the default, and
yes.
I would like to know, is there, do you ever consider, say, changing the skin color or ethnicity of character based on function rather than just feeling or aesthetic, such that you have, say, a dark-skinned character due to the fact that they're from a more southerly or, say, desert nation as compared to a more Northern nation? And do you ever, during the process, consider this character who is, say, non-white would work better as white?
For the second part, not really. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're talking about the ethnicity of a character, you can justify it however you want, but that's the way you chose to set up the world that way. It's like when I made Dragon Age, on the continent where the games take place, there is one nation in the far northeast called Ravane that has black characters. Now that it's all said and done, would I have done it differently if I went back in time? Maybe, but like to say now after I've set that up, oh, that's the only place that these characters can come from. So if I have to come up with sort of logical things like it doesn't make sense. Well, but it's our world. We choose what makes sense and what doesn't, right? So sometimes those kind of arguments can seem very self-serving, and you have to kind of be aware when you're making that kind of argument to sort of check yourself and go, okay, you know what? There are lots of reasons why we can justify making a character white or making them whatever we think is the default. And sometimes it is best just to go make them something else, and it will probably just work. You know, there are not. You say like, are there any practical reasons? I can't think of any. There are no practical reasons to make them something, but there's also no practical reasons not to. Does that make sense? Is there any other questions? Go one up front here.
Sorry, David, on this side, David.
Oh, this side? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering, obviously your audience is not just your players, it's also journalists and publishers.
Mm-hmm.
When you're communicating to those sorts of people, do you kind of flag it up front that there are diversity issues in the game that they might want to be aware of, or do you just allow them to discover it for themselves?
Do you mean like reviewers?
Reviewers, journos, publishers, because you put pitch documents together, you put out media releases. Do you flag that? Not
really, no. It's like even when I mentioned we did the press release for Dorian, we were going through each of the characters in turn. So it wasn't like I started off that interview, saying, oh, this is who Dorian is as a character, and he's from Tevinter, he's a mage, blah, blah. It wasn't like I prefaced that by saying, oh, by the way, just up front, he's gay. It's just, maybe that's not a good approach. Maybe we should flag that stuff for the journalists, but generally, in my experience, it's always been something that they just discover on their own and make up their own minds about it. I think there are probably people that assume that it's done otherwise, but not that I've ever seen. Sometimes you will have journalists who will come looking for that information specifically, because there's a certain amount of writing online where they talk about social issues in games. So you'll get someone who comes and says they want to talk about that in particular. But if we're talking about the game, to be honest, like for a game like the games that BioWare makes, the romances or any kind of inclusivity is like one part, and you're trying to get information out there on the game, which is so much, right? It could seem sometimes like there's a lot of focus on this one thing, and on one hand that's good, but on the other hand it can sometimes seem to be a little frustrating as a developer. Do we have one more here?
Let's see. Does this work there? Yeah, thank you. When a fan base reacts to a character, how do you sort the critique to be helpful in the future development?
So when the fan base reacts to a character in a game, how do you get the separate the good stuff from the bad stuff? It is hard because individually, when a fan complains, see a lot of times from their perspective, they're just asking. Like recently they're saying, oh, why can't Elsa be gay or what have you, and these are individually they're very reasonable questions or concerns that get brought up. It just, as a whole, from a developer's perspective, it's like this avalanche that just hits you, and it's like, oh, it's overwhelming. And especially when there's anger in that as well, it's like there's this wave of angry people. How do you? And if you get defensive or say, well, I can't deal with this, the answer you get a lot is, well, you aren't listening. And that may be true, but it's hard to listen. So the best thing you can do is look individually. This is my advice, and I have a hard time doing it. Look individually for the people that are being reasonable, and try not to respond. Don't encourage interaction by getting angry or responding to the people that are coming at you and being, from your perspective, unreasonable. But sort of reward the reasonable fans with the responses, or at least it doesn't hurt just to say thank you. I appreciate you telling me this. You don't have to dig in, and take it and think about it later. Anyway, I think we have other people coming on, so thank you very much, everyone.